It's been a while since I made an update on the front lines in Ukraine, and there is plenty to talk about. We are about a month into Ukraine's summer offensive, and it has been going slower than many people expected. I think it's also fair to say that it's not been going quite as Ukraine had hoped, but they have adjusted their approach, and it's possible that it can be a success later in the summer. So let's talk about it. I think it's good to start with the map updates. I will use maps from deepstatemap.live. They make some of the best maps of the front lines. And I'm going to show a lot of sort of before and after maps to show the developments. If we look at the whole front line, then it's possible to see some changes since the beginning of the Ukrainian offensive, but you have to look carefully. Like, it's not massive developments. In broad strokes, we can say that there have been three places where Ukraine has been pushing. It is around Bakhmut, it's around a city called Velyka Novosilka, and it's around a city called Orikhiv. And in between these places, we have actually seen the Russians sort of trying to push in some locations to see if they can regain the initiative, especially in the Luhansk region and in the Donetsk region. But these Russian attempts have not been sort of particularly successful. They've not led to significant changes in the front line. So the overall picture is that Ukraine has been gaining territory over the last month. Around Orikhiv, Ukraine has taken back an area that is about 12 kilometers wide and about 4 kilometers deep. So that's not an insignificant area. The goal is to get down to the city of Tokmak, which is sort of an important logistical hub for the Russian forces for the whole area. It's still about 20 kilometers to Tokmak, so there is some way to go. But the plan for the Ukrainians is that at some point there can be a kind of collapse among the Russians, and things can sort of start to go faster. If we go a bit more east to Velyka Novosilka, then it's this big bulge up here that the Ukrainians have taken. It's an area that is about 25 kilometers wide and about 7 kilometers deep, so it's quite significant. The bigger goal in both of these areas in the south is to cut the entire Russian occupied area into two. And that would challenge the Russian supply lines, and it could force the Russians to totally abandon large areas in the Kherson region because it would be unsustainable for them to continue the fight. But of course, the Russians have also figured this out, so they have built extremely strong defenses. There are several lines of defense that are fortified in different ways. So it's important to note also that the areas that Ukraine has taken in this part of the offensive, they are all before the first defensive line for the Russians. So they haven't even gotten to the first defensive line yet. So it's a huge task that is ahead for the Ukrainians. If we go on to the Bakhmut area, then the picture is somewhat different. In this area, the Russians don't quite have so entrenched positions as in the south. I think it's more, we can see this more as just a continuation of the battle for Bakhmut, which has been going on for about a year now. Like back in May, the Russians captured the city of Bakhmut, but that did not mean that the battle stopped. Since then, the Ukrainians have slowly taken territory both north and south of the city. And if this trend continues, then at some point within the coming months, then the Russians might have to leave the city to avoid being encircled. And this would just be a massive PR disaster for Russia because they made a very big deal out of it when they captured the city back in May. When we look at Bakhmut, there is not, I think, the same kind of strategic perspective with the offensive as there is in the south. If Ukraine makes a breakthrough here, then it's not obvious that that will have consequences that can set a whole new direction for the war, because it will not cut off Russian supply lines or something like that in a way that can create a kind of domino effect. So it may just be that Ukraine gets some territory back and that's it. But there are two other reasons why this battle for Bakhmut is important. First, it draws a lot of Russian resources because they have to reinforce this part of the front line to avoid losing Bakhmut. But also Ukraine really needs to show some results from this summer offensive. It is politically important that they demonstrate that they're able to beat Russia if they get the support they need. Because if they're not able to show some results with all the Western equipment that they have received for this offensive, then it will be harder to persuade the West to give them some more. So in that sense, the battle for Bakhmut might be strategically useful, although not quite as much as a breakthrough on the southern front. But if Ukraine manages to finally win the battle for Bakhmut, then it will be a pretty good victory as well. The last thing I want to briefly mention on the map is that in Kherson, the Ukrainians have conducted some operations across the river to see if they can take control over this island here. They have been using the ruins of the Antonovsky Bridge as a cover against attacks. There has been some quite significant fighting because the Russians have been taking this very seriously. And if the Ukrainians are able to establish real control here, then it can function as a bridgehead for the Ukrainian troops. I mean, a bridgehead in the military sense of the word, because the Antonovsky Bridge is, of course, already a bridge. But this could allow the Ukrainians to open up a new axis of attack against the Russians in the south, and it would be a massive challenge for the Russians to fight in multiple directions. I don't know if the Ukrainians will succeed with establishing control across the river, but it's definitely something that the Russians are concerned about. Okay, so what is the big picture? I think we need to use the distinction from military theory between maneuver warfare and attritional warfare. Maneuver warfare is a mobile kind of warfare where you try to outsmart your enemy by moving around. So you try to use speed and surprise to get an advantage on the battlefield by getting around the enemy and attacking on the flanks and those sorts of things. And the opposite of maneuver warfare is attritional warfare. It's a more primitive kind of warfare where you basically just throw a lot of firepower on the enemy and hope to exhaust them over time. So maneuver warfare is the more smart form of warfare. And if it's done well, then it is the best way to do it. And if we look at the military aid that Ukraine has received from the West to prepare for this offensive, then it looks like the ambition was to make it possible for Ukraine to do maneuver warfare. So they have received a lot of modern tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that are good for maneuver warfare. And when the offensive started for real in the beginning of June, then that was exactly what Ukraine tried to do. They engaged the new tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and it didn't work. Like very quickly, we saw pictures of destroyed Western equipment, and it was clear that this was not going to work. I think there were probably two things going on. Or two mistakes, we could say, being made. First, I think some of the Western donations were based on an assumption that the Russian military is more incompetent than it actually is. There have been so many stories about how stupid the Russians are and how rigid their command system is and so forth. So there was this idea that if we just gave the Ukrainians a bit of Western technology and sort of sprinkle some Western doctrine on top of it, then that was going to be vastly superior to what the Russians have. And that turned out not really to be the case. And then I think the other thing that people forget sometimes was that it is actually a kind of myth that the West only does maneuver warfare. In reality, maneuver warfare and attritional warfare are not really alternatives to each other in the way that it is sometimes perceived, because you need to wear down your enemy quite a bit before you can start running in circles around him. It's just that in the West, we tend to delegate that attritional part to the Air Force. So it's not done by the ground forces. The West will almost always have a strong air campaign before the ground forces show up on the battlefield. And then they will have air superiority during the fight. So there will be fighter aircraft that can provide close air support for the ground forces. But with the weapons package that the West provided to Ukraine, it's like there was this assumption that maneuver warfare could do it on its own without attrition. So we did not provide fighter aircraft, for example. We also did not provide long-range missiles like ATACMS. So the Russians got a lot of time to prepare their defensive positions without being hit with attritional fire. And what happened in the first week of the Ukrainian offensive was that it became clear that it would not be possible to break through the Russian the Russian lines with a pure maneuver approach. The Ukrainians basically drove into a wall, right? So there are so many weapons on the modern battlefield that can take out a tank, and without some kind of attrition first, it will not be possible to achieve any results because the Russian defensive lines are just too solid. So Ukraine changed their approach to a more attritional strategy instead. And that's what we're seeing now. They are still attacking and advancing on the front line, but it's mostly sort of infantry advancing by foot. And then they're focusing on attrition of the Russian forces in the hope that it will make it possible to try again with maneuver warfare sometime later in the summer. Most of the Western equipment that Ukraine has received is still not in use on the front lines. They're holding that back to be used later, but it will be necessary to do a lot of attrition of the Russian forces first. And this is where this discussion about cluster munitions comes into the picture, because the West has not provided Ukraine with fighter aircraft. So the attritional warfare is done by ground-based artillery. This war is first and foremost an artillery war, and it's very unusual if we compare it to the way that the West is used to fighting wars. Like if we try to imagine, for example, the Western invasion of Iraq being done without the support from the US Air Force, then we can maybe get an idea about what it is we're asking Ukraine to do here. Like it's very dramatic. So I think what we're seeing now is that both Ukraine and the West have started to realize how much attrition of the Russian forces it will take to achieve any results. And it's also becoming clear what the consequences are of the West not providing the weapons to Ukraine that are necessary to do that kind of attrition in a smart way. So that is why the US is now providing cluster munitions to Ukraine, because that is the only way to increase their firepower quickly to a level where it is realistic to achieve battlefield success. So with that in mind, I think we can understand where we are in the Ukrainian offensive. Philip O'Brien has written a good Substack on this that I'm going to link to in the video description. But his suggestion is that we understand the Ukrainian summer offensive as consisting of 4 distinct phases. And I think this is a good way to see it. The first phase was the initial attempt at maneuver warfare, where the Ukrainians rolled forward with their tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. This was a failure, so they moved on to the second phase quickly. This second phase is attrition of the Russian artillery. Ukraine is going very hard after destroying Russian artillery pieces and their support equipment. And this is the phase we're in right now, and we can see that by the number of Russian artillery pieces that are being destroyed at this moment. It is very high compared to the normal level. So it seems clear that the Ukrainians are going specifically after the Russian artillery. And then when at some point they feel that they have achieved what they can with this, then they will probably move on to the third phase, which will be attrition of the Russian manpower. So this will mean hitting the trenches in the Russian defensive positions. And this is where cluster munitions will come into play, because they are much better than standard ammunition at hitting a trench system. You would need ridiculous amounts of artillery ammunition to achieve the same results without cluster munitions. And then the fourth phase will be that Ukraine will try maneuver warfare again to see if they can break through the Russian lines. So this is a very long process that will require patience. It is too soon to tell whether it will be a success or not, but it looks like the Ukrainians have a plan, and that plan is to focus on attrition in the coming time. How long that will take, it's hard to say, but it could be several months. The time window where the weather will be suitable for big military operations, it runs until October, and I don't think they're going to rush this, because if they go back to a maneuver phase too soon, then the result will just be the same as last time. It will not work. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video useful, please give it a like, and also subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to receive notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.